I wonder what you make of my suggestion that that presidency has been a disappointment.
It has been a disappointment.
Marcus Jooste, basically when he had been found out,
Yeah.
he kind of ran away.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know if he ever apologized to you.
South Africa, its history shows that it's a lucky country.
He's lived through every major shift in South Africa since the Second World War, not as a spectator, but as a builder. From a modest family shop in the Northern Cape to the creation of Africa's largest retail empire, Christo Wiese has struck deals, shaped strategy, and helped build the economic landscape we recognize today. He's scaled heights few ever glimpse and even endured some falls. Yet now, in his 80s, he remains energetic, curious, and fiercely committed to South Africa. It's my great honor to welcome Dr. Christo Wiese to SMWX.
Thank you, Sizwe. It's a great pleasure to be in conversation with you.
So wonderful to be speaking with you. It's a great honor. Your let's say the first phase of your life gives me great hope, because I think we suspect with people as successful as you are that you always knew what you wanted to do and had it figured out. But the more I looked into those first 35 years, you were really doing lots of different things and trying to find where it was that you would end up. Like you said, the bar, mining, maybe not even doing that well at university at the start.
Yeah.
And that's quite reassuring to know that you don't always have to have it perfectly right early.
You know, I'm often confronted with this comment that people think that people who managed to achieve something had a blueprint. Nothing can be further from the truth. There is no blueprint. In business particularly, it's all about opportunistic events. There is no blueprint, and I often tell the story, it's ascribed to Dr. Anton Rupert, that he was asked when he was in his 70s about, how it was for him. And his reply was that if he knew how difficult it was going to be to make a success in business, he would have stayed as a lecturer at the university. And yet, now that he's in his 70s and he looks back over his career, he is amazed at how easy it was. And I think that if people can understand that, first of all, there's no blueprint. I mean, if you take the Rembrandt Empire as an example, the money initially was made in tobacco and liquor, but the greater fortune and the greater empire was built in luxury goods. So it's pure opportunities that presented itself and that were exploited.
And when you did come back from the bar, and I think sold the diamond mine, which helped you gain that controlling stake or important stake in Pep's stores at the time.
That's right.
Did you know that you were now going to finally be settling in on something that would then last for the rest of your life? Was there a moment of realization where you felt that, I'm finally at home now?
No, I don't think so. I never had that thought because on one occasion particularly, I was close to selling the business. That was after I'd been back in the business for about 8 years or so. I just thought, the children started arriving and, I had to sort of reassess my life again. But thereafter, I never really thought again that I want to do something else. Because I tried to make my business career more interesting than just doing the one thing, which is a prerequisite for success in the beginning. You've got to focus, do one thing. But, we built the business, Pep Stores acquired ShopRite, and other businesses, and we started building businesses abroad. So, you know, I kept it very interesting. It never became stale.
Living wealthier is about experiencing more of the world. With Standard Bank Private, you get access to travel and lifestyle benefits and the cheapest forex rates from Shift. Live a wealthier life with exclusive travel discounts.
One of the things that stands out for me when we speak about Pep stores and eventually ShopRite is giving dignity to people and trying to make basic amenities, basic things that we use in our everyday lives affordable, so that people could have a sense of dignity. That seemed to be quite an important reason for the business.
Very much so, and that's part of why it was so successful. Because, you know, those of us who are in more fortunate circumstances in life have no idea what it does to people's self-image if they are not required to dress in hand-me-downs or torn clothing. You can't imagine it because it's probably never happened to you. You know, we just accept that you always have clothes, clean clothes. And so that made, I saw the difference it made to people's lives. I mean, apart from the fact that the people who joined the business, tens of thousands of them, I mean, between Pep and ShopRite today, they employ over 200,000 people.
Wow.
And that made a huge difference for people who would otherwise not have had those opportunities. But the big difference was the contribution it made to the quality of life, to the vast bulk of the consumers who made those businesses grow.
Of course, ShopRite and all that you built in retail is legendary, and there was a legendary team, which was you and YT Basson.
Sure.
What do you think made that combination work so well?
The simple answer is pure luck. You know, people always, again, coming back to this blueprint thing. YT Basson and I became friends at university. We were together in Wilgenhof. I was his senior. And we both came from similar backgrounds, Afrikaans, country people, and both of us were Bloedsappe, you know, the United Party. So we were against the government of the day, which was the National Party. So that was a bond, a common bond, Wilgenhof and the political connection. And YT, as you know, qualified as a chartered accountant and, you know, just turned out to be a brilliant, but really brilliant retailer.
Do you have any memories of how, when you were working at your peak, you were able to move these great mountains and build this massive retail empire?
Well, I think essentially one step at a time, because that is the thing about retail. It applies to other businesses as well, but in retail, it's all about building one brick at a time. You've got your recipe, your formula. I mean, to this day, those two businesses between them open between 200 and 300 new stores every year. You know, now you start thinking about that. It's simple to say, but if you think there are only 220 working days in a year, and that means they're opening a new shop every day. So once you, that's the beauty about mass retailing. If you get it right, the momentum is your friend. The risk on that is if you get it slightly wrong, the momentum can drive you to a very unhappy end. Because the numbers are so huge.
You played an interesting role as chairman, and I wonder what you think makes an effective chair of of a meeting, of a company? Are there any things that you learned that you found particularly useful in the specific role of chair, which you often played?
Well, you know, the way PEP developed, I mean, the founder was a chap called Renier van Rooyen, who was certainly one of South Africa's 5 greatest entrepreneurs. I mean, if you think what he started with, one little shop in Uppington, the size of this room, slightly bigger.
Yeah.
That's what he started with. And although he was chairman, obviously, and he was the largest shareholder at that stage, as I subsequently became, it was the way I saw chairmanship was more as an owner, really, that it was a very paternalistic culture in both businesses. It was like a family. And that the major role of that position was to inspire people, to make ordinary people believe, including oneself, that you can achieve extraordinary things. Because if you look back at the people who started in PEP stores, I mean, they were teachers, policemen, people who worked for the post office, people who worked on the railways, who had no idea of being a retailer. And yet, with the proper training, proper encouragement, they managed to build this impressive business.
I'm always fascinated with business titans and their approach to meetings. Are you one for the meeting? And is there a way that you try to make meetings effective? Or do you try to minimize the number of meetings? How do you have an effective meeting?
You know, that's a rather difficult question to answer if I now have to apply my mind to it. You know, I sometimes think my entire life is about meetings. Because whether it's a formal meeting like a board, or whether it's one-on-one with one of my colleagues or 2 or 3 of them. And yeah, you just try to, you know, make it light, but at the same time deal with the issues. Because, you know, the one thing you learn in business, which is very critical, is that the worst decision is not to make a decision. You often make wrong decisions, but you've got to get to a decision. And obviously it helps if there are more people than one trying to figure out what the decision should be.
Was there a moment in your life, and I'm thinking particularly of the years between, say, 2010, 2016, or even 2005 to 2016, where your fortune was growing so vastly that you took a step back and drunk it all in? Or was it constantly just trying to reach the next milestone and the next milestone?
Well, yeah, you know, if I now look back at it today, everything was running so smoothly. I had such wonderful colleagues in Whitey Besson and Peter Erasmus in PEP that, you know, things were almost running on autopilot. And, you know, the businesses were just so exciting. And every day there was something new. Yeah, and I think if I have to be very honest, I probably started becoming a bit lazy because, you know, it all seemed to go so smoothly. And that's one of the reasons for the misstep in Steinhoff. That, you know, I thought here is a big challenge because in South Africa, the group was faced with the difficulty of the competition regime that we couldn't really grow much bigger. And I thought this was an easy way to, here was a company with an international balance sheet and we could, you know, grow the business all over the world. That was the plan.
That's actually very interesting to hear. And I mean, in some ways, I feel that the Steinhoff story has been done to death in a way.
It has been done to death, I hope. But,
indeed. But what I'm interested in on that front is how you felt.
Well, look, first of all, it's a hell of a shock.
Yeah.
You know, when it finally dawned that what this fellow had done, and you know how many people made mistakes
Yeah.
that led to other people like myself becoming aware when the horse had bolted. So, of course, a huge shock. And I've often explained that, you know, I had to look myself in the mirror and say, now there's 50 years of work and risk and whatever goes with it
Yeah.
going down the tubes.
Wow.
How do I deal with it? But I have explained before, I took 3 decisions. Number 1,
Yeah.
I'm not going to become bitter, because nobody wants to be around bitter people.
Yeah.
And the second one is that I don't mourn the loss of money, because money comes and goes. I mean, history teaches you that. You know, people make fortunes, lose fortunes, make fortunes again.
Absolutely.
Families start off with fortunes, end in poverty. So don't mourn the loss of money.
Yeah.
And the third one is a lesson that my mother had taught me from a very tender age. Always count your blessings. Don't focus on the things you don't have or the things you've lost, the things you'd want to have.
Yeah.
Count your blessings. Look at what you have. And in my case, I was fortunate enough that, you know, I had enough that it wouldn't affect my lifestyle, although it was a large amount of money that had gone up in smoke. And I had a wonderful family, got wonderful friends. I live in the most beautiful city in, to my mind, the best country in the world. So that's my blessings.
I love the insight about never mourning money, only people.
Only people I mourn, yeah.
And I think what's so fascinating about your life is that many people have seen what it's like for a fortune to build.
Yeah,
Others have seen what it's like. They inherit a fortune and they lose some of it.
right.
Of course, you've rebuilt very impressively after the Steinhoff moment, but you've seen both of those things, which very few people get to see.
Yeah.
What did that teach you about wealth?
Well, that it is fleeting. The point I made earlier, it comes and it goes. I mean, you know, history is full of examples of people who built fortunes, lost it, built it again. But families, you know, the old 3-generation clogs to clogs,
Yeah.
that our people simply don't. Now, I've often said, and it came to haunt me because I often told my children and other people, I made the comment that it's easier to make money than to keep it, than to hang on to it. That's another challenge and another discipline altogether.
So important.
And easy to make money if you're prepared to work hard and you apply yourself. Everybody can make money, but to hang on to it is another challenge.
I watched an interview that you did, and I wished another question was asked of you, because you told the story of how Marcus Jooste, basically when he had been found out,
Yeah.
he kind of ran away.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know if he ever apologized to you.
No, he never did. What was really terrible is that he went and apologized to one other person that told me he came to him and apologized, who had lost not nearly the sort of money that he didn't have the sort of money to lose, but even proportionately he lost less.
Yeah.
And he came and told me with great glee how Jooste came to him with tears in his eyes and apologized. He never did apologize to me. One of his friends years later told me that he kept saying to the friend,
Yeah.
I should go to Christo and apologize. But of
Right.
course he never did. Never did.
And how do you look back on him now that he's no longer with
No,
us?
well, for me, he ceased to exist when it became clear what he'd done. I mean, as a human being, I mean, he just... I don't believe in feuds and running my life on hate. Because I had a friend who always used to teach people that if you hate, the hate owns you, not the guy you hate. I mean, he couldn't care less. So I tried to run my life that way, but as far as he was concerned, I just, as I say, as a human being, he ceased to exist. I mean, I couldn't care. It sounds pretty harsh, but unfortunately, what he did to people, forget about me,
Sure.
I took the blow and I could handle it, but there were other people who suffered greatly. I mean, the general body of shareholders.
Sure.
People lost lots of money, which they couldn't really afford to lose. So, I mean, it's just... and the way he did it, now that the reports have come out, they've surfaced, it was so brazen. It was just without any regard in terms of any accountability. It really is bad. So I'm sorry to say that because it's a little bit against my nature, but
Sure.
But in his case, I decided that there is an exception.
No, absolutely, because I would imagine, and I would have thought that when it all became clear that he had obviously made this terrible mistake, he might have even secretly said sorry.
Well, as I say, I know of one person
that
came and told me that, Jooste had come, and he and Jooste remained friends, right until the end. So, but I mean, I could never do that.
Yeah. I'm interested in how the law features in your life. I know that some of your children went into the law.
Yeah.
You studied law.
Yeah.
You actually practiced at the bar. And even though you haven't practiced for your whole life, to what extent has the law and knowing the law been a feature of understanding business?
No, I think it was hugely helpful. And I advised my children, two of them did their LLB degrees.
Yes.
I advised them, whatever you want to do, I mean, that training can only help you to think logically and, to try and get what always troubles lawyers, try and get the facts right and know that it's the facts that will determine the outcome at the end of the day.
And not to be able to be bamboozled by lawyers either.
That's right, yeah. So, no, I think it's very, very helpful in business, extremely helpful. And I would recommend to anybody, it may be better to qualify as a CA, although I've also seen that sometimes the lawyer training is better. Better.
Interesting. Can we move to the country?
Yeah.
I mean, the first question I wanted to ask on that was, how do you respond to this term, the Stellenbosch Mafia? Firstly, given that you don't live in Stellenbosch, but that it's kind of taken on a life of its own. There have been books.
Yeah.
I think Julius Malema has used the term previously. What do you make of the term?
I think it's laughable because several of the people, including myself, don't even live in Stellenbosch. But of course, we have a Stellenbosch connection because I studied there.
Sure.
And I think, the Stellenbosch Mafia thing is kind of like in the category of the white monopoly capital thing. It's just something that somebody thought up to, because people are so inclined to have these conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
It's always this lot or that lot that's ruling the world. And so I see it in that light. I mean, I find it laughable because I happen to know that amongst those guys who are classified as the Stellenbosch Mafia, between several of them, there isn't a lot of love lost. You know, they don't particularly like each other.
Yeah, yeah.
And I can hardly imagine them ever conspiring to do something together.
That's
not
interesting.
my impression.
It speaks to, and you probably have a unique viewpoint on this, South Africans' fascination with wealthy
Yeah.
people. There's maybe even an unhealthy fascination with very wealthy people
Yeah.
in South Africa. Do you find
I
that?
think that is so, but I am aware of countries where it's much worse. I mean, people tell me, you know, in Australia, for instance, I mean, the
Yeah.
tall poppy syndrome, I mean, you must always try to kind of stay below the parapet. I've never really thought of, you know, people's fascination with wealth as something that's unhealthy. I grew up in a town and in an area where there were a few wealthy people and a lot of middle class people and a lot of poor people. And I, you know, the way we looked at wealthy people was, if anything, to be inspired, to say, but if that person can do it, so can I. And, you know, in the business, young people coming in, I often told them, look at the people around you. If that guy can make it, so can you. I mean, if I could make it, so can you. There's no magic to it. Simple rules, if you follow them, it should work.
You've spoken about hard work quite often in your rise, and what does that look like? What does hard work look like? Because sometimes I get the feeling that those who work really hard don't actually know how hard they work in a way.
Well, you know, work can be defined differently, obviously.
Yeah, yeah.
What I mean by work in my life means that if you're in a business and you're building a business, you've got to eat, sleep, dream your business. I mean, you've really got to do things when they need to be done. You know, it's too easy to say, I'll leave it today, I'm going to play golf today and I'll do it tomorrow. A lot of people fall in that trap.
Sure.
So what I mean by work is not that you have to be pouring sweat all the time and be at the office 18 hours a day. That's not what I mean by work. What I mean is the total commitment. And then, of course, in that commitment, particularly when you have a family, you have to try to find the balance because you only have one life.
Yeah.
And too many people, I think, are so committed that they neglect that part of their lives.
You mentioned the ironic thing about many of the people in the so-called Stellenbosch Mafia actually not necessarily being on the best terms.
Yeah.
I was reading in Peter du Toit's book where he says, and I don't know if this is true, which is why I put it to you, that it's no secret that there is bad blood between you and Mr. Rupert. Is that true?
Well, certainly not from my side. You know, we had a business deal where the two of us were on opposite ends.
Okay.
And I came out on top of that little squabble.
Okay.
But that's never made me bear a grudge.
Yeah.
I don't know from his side. I mean, when we see each other, we're friendly and greet each other and so, but we're not really firm friends.
Sure. What was the deal?
It was a diamond deal, a company that one of the Rembrandt companies was going to make a takeover bid. And I happened to be the largest shareholder in that company.
I see.
And, you know, that I pushed for a higher price at the end of the day. That's the simple story. I mean, But it was very well reported on the Financial Mail, ran a front page article on the whole Sorry saga.
Is that so?
Yeah, and so if you go back to those years, I can't even remember the year,
Yes,
2000, I think, you'll find the story there.
Okay. And so no ill will from your
No,
side?
none from my side.
Yeah.
None from my side.
Yeah.
I think life's too short, as I say, to run feuds.
Yeah.
You know, why would you run a feud? I mean, you have a disagreement, sure, but you carry on. I mean, if I had to run feuds with all the people that I disagreed with, I mean, I'd spend my life doing it. But I don't. It's nonsense.
How do you react to South Africa's GNU and this new political moment in which we find ourselves?
Well, first of all, I am an incurable optimist. I always see the bright side. And for one very simple reason, nobody has ever been able to show me what the benefit is of not being positive. I just don't get it. We all know that the world is full of problems and it's not a moonshine and roses. But the point is, so I try to see the positive element in all these developments, and I think the GNU is a positive development. Because the comment I made to you earlier, that part of the sadness in South Africa is that we seem to find it so difficult to speak to each other. And debate with each other in a civilized manner. At the dinner where I met Prince, I told them, my reasons for optimism, the normal 5 points. And then I said, and there is now a new point that I've added to my list. And that is, I remember in the 80s, in the run-up to 1990, I was part of one or two of these discussion groups. People would get together and talk. People from different political persuasions, even people from different social groups. I mean, my friend Franklin Son, who died on Friday, he was one of the guys in those groups that I remember, and many others.
Wow. Okay.
And maybe I'm just out of it, but since the 1990s, since the transition, I'm not aware of people getting together and having those chats.
Sure.
It's happening now. Wherever you go, you hear, we went to this little group and we went to that little group. And we talked again about how do we get to where we need to be.
Absolutely.
And let's find a way. We know that we're not on the right track at the moment. So what do we do to get on the right track? And that was the similar vein of the discussion in the 1980s leading up to 1990.
I mean, even a conversation like this, I think, will surprise many people. And so I agree, this need for us to, we're all in the same political community.
Absolutely.
So we need to find a way to...
And we've got so much to be positive about. I have this little rhyme, so I'm going to sing it for you as well. Whenever people now ask me, what do you think of South Africa now? And people often ask me, particularly foreigners. My first reaction is, compared to what? Let's start there. Let's compare ourselves. Look at the rest of the world. And I mean, I don't see very happy pictures in too many places.
Sure.
So let's start there. And then, I add always that when people ask me during the transition, are you going to stay or go? I said, I'm staying for a number of reasons. But the main reason is I believe the majority of people in South Africa are good people. There are countries where you cannot say that of people, but the majority are good people. And that in the end will matter. And the other thing, which is a more practical reason, is if you look at the other so-called failed African states, South Africa differs from them in one very important aspect, and that is we have a very vibrant, large, competent, committed private sector.
Sure.
Whatever the government cannot do, and governments cannot do most things.
We've certainly discovered that.
The private sector can fix it tomorrow. I firmly believe that these developments that we now see with electricity and the rail and the water and what have you, I firmly believe that if government would get out of the way, this country can turn on a tiki. A year from now, you won't recognize it. If we can get away from the mistake that we made in the previous dispensation, tied to an ideology that could never last, if we can get rid of our ideological hang-ups and become pragmatic and say, we're here to try to make life better for everyone in this country. This country, in a year, can become unrecognizable.
There's no doubt about that.
So that's the way I see it.
Yeah, I think we have all the ingredients to be an economic powerhouse.
Yeah.
And we somehow keep snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, but also not necessarily falling into the decline that many people predict for us.
Absolutely,
either.
that people predicted, yeah.
I mean, the current political moment seems to be coming out of a Ramaphosa presidency that really stoked great hope in the country.
Indeed.
And I wonder what you make of my suggestion that that presidency has been a disappointment.
It has been a disappointment. You know, I have very high regard for the president as a person. He's a good person, and I'm sure he would have wanted to have a better legacy than what he's going to be stuck with. I've always defended him because I blame the system. A system where a president can be recalled at any time by 7 or 8 people that don't bear the ultimate responsibility of running the country is wrong. I'm beginning to move also in favor of the president being elected directly.
Completely agree.
And you shouldn't have I mean, can you imagine being a president and you've seen what's happened to your 2 predecessors, and you've got to do something that really goes against the grain in the view of some people. I mean, but the next day you can be recalled and you can land the country in a worse situation. So I always had sympathy and I defended on that basis, but I do think there are elements where the government, not necessarily the president, but the government had failed miserably. And I mean, the worst is, of course, the police, and now apparently the judiciary, and certainly our prosecuting authority. I mean, that, you know, I was fortunate enough to have lunch with the former Prime Minister of Singapore. Like 2 years ago, I think. He was in Cape Town. He invited a few of us to lunch. And I was a great fan of his father's. I mean, he was a really brilliant guy.
Of course.
And I admired him, the son as well. And at the little speech, it was a lunch, and he said, you know, people tend to forget that the primary function of a government is law and order. If you let slip that, if you let the rule of law go, you have a huge problem. I happened to be at a conference with Neil Ferguson last week.
Yes, the historian.
And there was the chief advisor of the president of Argentina. And he said, you know, that president said, the top priority is restoring the rule of law and the sanctity of contract. And they changed that country in months. And not,
Yeah.
I mean, they did a lot of other things too, but I mean,
Sure.
the approach was the rule of law and sanctity of contract.
While I disagree with a lot of Argentina's, or some of Argentina's economic policy, what is refreshing is someone was decisive. Someone
absolutely.
took a decision and led the ship in a particular. And it feels as if we've been in this limbo of no one really making any actual decisions on the economy, whether decisively left or decisively right at this point.
Your point is very, very well taken. That, you know, decisiveness. That I said that earlier on in business. I mean, make a decision.
Yeah, absolutely.
And move. No, you perfectly. And of course, the difficulty is, in my view, remains this attachment to you know, obsolete ideologies. You know, so you know this. We should really do this. But it doesn't match the ideology.
Absolutely.
It's crazy.
And in many ways, the most successful economies in the world, the Singapores of this world, they borrowed from all kinds of different ideologies.
All kinds.
Yeah.
You know, I love telling this story, so I'm wasting your time now.
No,
but
far from it.
I had this, as I say, huge admiration for Lee Kuan Yew.
Yes, of course.
And then my wife and I were invited to have dinner with him a few years ago. And we got there and he was already very frail.
Wow.
He was then addressed as Minister Mentor. You know, he was Prime Minister, then he became Senior Minister.
Yeah.
And by that time he was now Minister Mentor. So he made his speech and there was no occasion for questions, and I got up and I said to him, Minister Mentor, I'm from Africa and I have a question for you. In Africa, we used to, when we looked abroad, we used to look west. Increasingly, we are looking east. What do you think of that, and what do you think we should do to make ourselves more attractive to the east? And you know, he looked at me, he said, Africa. He said, who cares about Africa? And he went on, he said, it's a continent riddled with crime and violence and disease. And he finished off by saying, I won't send Singaporeans to Africa until Singapore Airlines flies there. And I thought, but my wife and I flew in from Cape Town this morning on Singapore Airlines.
Yeah.
But I didn't say anything, obviously.
Sure.
And driving back to the hotel, my wife said, but what was that all about?
Yeah.
I said, you know, I figured it out. He does not regard South Africa as part of Africa. And you know what's the worst of it? Neither did a lot of South Africans. We never really considered South Africa being something apart from Africa. Because he was in South Africa. Lee Kuan Yew paid a visit once or twice he was here.
Wow.
But he made the statement that I won't send a Singaporean to Africa until Singapore Airlines flies there.
Yeah.
So that clearly he distinguished between South Africa and Africa.
And actually, so much of the important work done with ShopRite and other entities has been about recognizing that the opportunity is actually in Africa.
It is, regrettably, our experience in ShopRite has not been a great one.
Sure, we had
and
Egypt.
And for one simple reason, and I mean, I think African countries are beginning to realize that. They're single commodity economies, and when the oil price goes down, the currency collapses. So if you go as an investor, you may do very well in the local currency, but by the time you've converted it to the home currency, you can't make money. I mean, that's been our experience. And therefore, we were in 8 or 10 African countries. We're only in Angola, Zambia, Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho, Those are the only countries that outside South Africa that we find we can do proper business and get a proper return in real money. But that will change, of course. That will change.
You know, when you're speaking of Lee Kuan Yew, you must have met some fascinating people over the years at various junctures.
Yeah.
Does any memory stand out at any particular point?
Well, he must be one of the
sure.
top ones. I met, particularly at these conferences with Neil Ferguson.
Yes.
I mean, we've just come back from one.
Yes.
And there were some very interesting people.
I believe you said you met Elon Musk at one of these.
At one of
Neil
his
Ferguson.
at one of his conferences
How
in
was that?
Spain.
How was that?
Well, that was a
interaction?
strange experience.
Yeah.
Because I asked Neil that I would like to have a private word with Elon Musk, not while we're having the conference sessions.
Yeah.
And he said no, he'll arrange for Elon to come down from his room early in the morning. We were on a beautiful wine estate in Spain. And I walked into the courtyard and he came down the steps. And this is years ago. I can't remember the exact year, but like 2014 or so. And I walked up to him and addressed him in Afrikaans. And he looked at me as if I was from Mars.
Really?
I mean, it was a strange experience.
Huh.
I had some business proposition I thought that he could be interested in.
Yeah.
But obviously he had no interest. But it was a funny experience.
Wow.
And,
Wow.
So that's the only interaction I've had with him.
Interesting.
But I've met many other very interesting people.
Can imagine.
General Petraeus, who was the commander in Iraq. Dominic Strauss-Kahn, shortly after his perp walk in New York.
Wow.
He came. Neil must have invited him to the conference before that incident.
Right.
And I mean, he was going to be president of France.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he was at the conference. I met Hernando de Soto, who wrote The Mystery of Capital. It's also one of my heroes. And Peter Thiel.
Yes, okay. Who also has a South African connection.
And a very interesting chap called Karl Theodor zum Gutenberg. He was Minister of Defense of West Germany under Merkel when he was 34 years old.
Wow. It actually brings me back to something you said about Marcus Jooste, which was, it wasn't so much the errors he had made, but it was the refusal to face them.
Yeah.
That was actually the deeper sin, if I may.
That was it. He was.
Yeah.
I mean, I ascribe it to arrogance.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
His businesses weren't quite working, and that hubris that you can't admit. Look, I've made a bad mistake here. We take a beating. Particularly when you're a public, listed company, you take a huge beating. I mean, I've been through that a few times. And made a mistake, well, we've got to make it right.
Yeah.
But it's that inability to act. And I mean, most of us are like that. It's not easy to say, look, I screwed up.
Yeah.
And so if people often ask me, what do you think went wrong? Because he was a highly intelligent guy and had great talents. And on the face of it, a very, very hard worker. I've often told the story when people came to me gossiping and saying, you know that Joste's got a girlfriend.
Yeah. My
reaction was, there's no way he can have a girlfriend because he works 18 hours a day, 7 days a week.
There's just no time.
I mean, to run a girlfriend takes, apart from money, takes time. And
that's for sure.
But I did decide to confront him. I said, Marcus, people tell me you've got a girlfriend. He said, Christo, of all people, you should know that for me it's impossible because of the way I have to run my life. And I bought it.
There we are.
Yeah, only to find that.
Yeah.
In any case.
I have two more questions. I mean, the one you already alluded to, which is this General Mkhwanazi
Yes.
and his allegations, which are deeply worrying.
Deeply worrying.
And I wonder how you react to a senior person in the police coming out and saying that criminal syndicates are trying to influence very high reaches of government.
No, look, it's terrible. But I mean, quite frankly, Sizwe, we must all have been aware for a long time that something is badly wrong in our judicial system. I mean, we didn't know that the rot was that deep, but we sensed, you know, mostly I think we ascribed it to incompetence. That, you know, with the transition, people just, all the old people left and people were appointed to positions which they simply were not capable of managing. And so we ascribed it to that. But one should have suspected that in that environment, people are set up to be corrupted. And so it is a very worrying thing, and hopefully that will be one of the factors that will make us change direction.
Indeed.
That people, you know, can you imagine the man in the street? I mean, in those townships where, you know, the crime is so rife. And I mean, to learn that, but the people who are supposed to protect me are part of the problem. It must be terrible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, so I'm hoping that a lot of good will come of it. But of course, we're all holding our breath to say, well, what's going to happen next?
Yeah, indeed.
And, you know, listening to the budget, I mean, again, this commission is costing 150 million rand. I mean, just money. I mean, it's...
Goodness knows how much we've spent on commissions.
On commissions. I mean, billions.
Yeah.
Billions.
Yeah.
And if any good would have come of it, but, you know, I don't quite buy that no good came of it. Sure, we haven't seen people in orange overalls yet.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people must be sleeping very uneasily. At least I hope.
And I think this commission has actually revealed a lot already, which we as the public can use.
The revelation is one thing, but the action is what we all sit here and wait to see what is actually going to happen.
One last thing is our country is going through a very difficult moment with our American counterparts. And of course, this is in large part based on President Trump's accusations that there is some kind of
genocide, I mean.
Or persecution of only either white South Africans or the Afrikaner community. So we've got that, but on the other hand, we can't ignore the US either. I mean, how do you react to this moment, which kind of impugns the credibility of South Africa unfairly, but also has to be grappled with in terms of this powerful country?
You know, Sizwe, I'm going to give an answer which may upset a lot of people, but in our situation in South Africa, if I can now speak as a white and as an Afrikaner, I always tell my children and my colleagues, the way for us to deal with what, you know, to make this country work, is know your place. Don't try to be bigger than you are. Know your place, and that comes back to my point. Talk to each other and try and find common ground and do things together. I don't mean that you're a lesser citizen.
Sure.
Now, when it comes to America, I mean, I think, you know, I wouldn't want to go on record. President Trump will block me from the US if I say what I really think about a lot of the things coming out of the US.
Wow.
But again, as South Africa, we have to know our place. We are a small country.
Sure.
And to keep poking the bear, I mean, it cannot be a good strategy. Try and put your case, but put it softly, gently, back it up with facts, I mean, one of the things that kind of bothered me with that interview with Trump in the White House was, if I remember correctly, the defense on the farm murders was, no, but it's not only the farmers that get murdered.
Yeah, everyone.
We murder each other. I mean,
we murder everyone.
yeah, we all get murdered. I mean, what kind of defense is that?
Yeah, it's not great for building confidence.
No. So, but as I say, my view is simply that in our interaction with America and reacting to what they're doing, no, we're a small country. And don't make as if they cannot do without us. I mean, that's just such a misunderstanding of how the world works. I think America, at some stage, there will be regime change.
Yeah, yeah.
And things will become more favorable for us. But in the meantime, we shouldn't be poking the bear. We should be very diplomatic about it, without creeping. But so that's where I am on that one. It's
yeah.
Because the Americans that I talk to, well, I mean, it's, maybe 10 people out of 300 million, but there is no real animosity towards South Africa.
Yeah.
So hopefully, it'll be a passing phase. At the same time, I must say that some of our policy initiatives in this country need to be criticized by people who have a different view of how we should go about making of this country what it should be.
Sure.
So criticism is fair.
One of the things that as we close, again, interests me about your life is how you've stayed in South Africa despite being fabulously wealthy. Say that you wouldn't go anywhere else. A lot of your family is also in South Africa.
Yeah.
Why do you stay, and why do you remain such a passionate and loyal South African?
Well, that's very simple. I mean, as I said to you before, I believe the vast majority of this country are good people. Secondly, this country has shown itself to be very resilient. The third one is, some people may laugh when I say it, but I believe countries, like human beings, are either lucky or unlucky. And South Africa, its history shows that it's a lucky country. Can you imagine how different the movie could have been if Mandela and de Klerk were not there at the same time? It would certainly have been different.
Yeah.
That I can tell you.
Yeah.
That's luck. And there are many instances in South African history. I mean, the other one that I like quoting is the Boer republics decided to go to war against the British Empire. They were the nicest people to lose to, because look what happened. The Boers governed 2 provinces.
Yeah.
They lost the war, and 6 years later, Britain gave them the whole of South Africa. They knew the Afrikaners would rule because of the way they structured the constitution.
Absolutely.
Which, as you know, is interesting, that the first apartheid law was a law of the British Parliament. And it was a National Party government that abolished the colour bar in parliamentary politics. People tend to not focus on that. That the first apartheid law was a law passed by the British Parliament.
And sorry, but this is
the Constitution of South Africa.
This is so interesting to me. I know we said we were ending, and then a Boer general serves Britain in both wars.
Absolutely. Yeah, and who fought them bitterly. I mean, he took a commando, Smuts took a commando all the way to Darling, 45 miles from Cape Town. to lay siege to Cape Town.
Wow.
And when the war ended, and he was bitterly criticized, it's part of the sadness of Afrikaner history, that Smuts' genius was never properly recognized by his own people. He was, you know, everywhere else he was feted and given honors and served in the British War Cabinet. Close friend. The story is, and I believe it's true, that Churchill on his desk at his home in England, Hartwell, on his desk he had a few photographs of his family, and the only other was a photograph of Smuts.
Wow.
That's how highly he regarded Smuts.
There's actually a brilliant new biography of Smuts that I'm reading now by an academic at UJ called Bongani Ngulunga.
Oh, well, I'd like to read it,
Yeah, so
I read Richard Stein's.
Yes, Stein's one is brilliant as well.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's one. You know, one of the sadnesses of our history, and mainly the Afrikaners' history, is that we don't really, you know, do this hero worship of the really great people that this country had produced. Really great people.
And we have many, and it's what you say about South Africa being lucky is, I've always thought, even just in the 20th century, very few nations had so many great people who passed through, from Churchill to Gandhi to Mandela to all kinds, somehow found their way
country.
here. Yeah,
lucky country.
Well,
and something rubbed off.
Indeed.
You know, from all of them.
Indeed.
Something rubbed off.
Well, I've been very lucky to speak with you for so long, and I really appreciate the opportunity, Dr. Christo Wiese. It's been an honor and a privilege to mine your considerable wisdom.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.